Russia is leaving Kherson. And frankly, it looks like a kind of collapse because it's going so fast that it's really hard to think that this can be an orderly retreat. But in this video, I want to share some reflections about what it means for the war in a broader perspective. Because if Russia withdraws from Kherson, then the whole war basically moves into a whole new phase. And I think it's worth spending some time thinking about what that means. A good starting point is to look at what Russia is losing when they leave Kherson. Frankly, they should probably have done this months ago, but they didn't do that because the consequences were unacceptable. So it makes sense to just recap what those consequences are because it shows why it's a big deal. The first thing to be aware of is that it's extremely difficult to attack across a big river where you can't use the bridges. So when Russia withdraws from this area west of the Dnipro, then that means that this might be forever. It will be extremely hard for them to come back. Russia could attack Kherson in the beginning of the war because Ukraine was not ready for the fight in this area. But now, of course, they will prepare a defense that makes it impossible for Russia to come back. The second thing to note is that since Putin went through with the annexation of the occupied areas, then in a Russian perspective, this is Russian territory. And Kherson is a Russian city. It's very hard to imagine that Russia is willing to give up a Russian city to another government. Like they should want to get it back, but it's almost impossible to see how they can do that if they don't have a foothold on the western bank of the river. And the final reason why this is a big loss for Russia is that it's a final goodbye to the idea of a Russian attack further along the Black Sea coastline. So there is no longer a risk that Russia is going to take Mykolaiv or Odessa or close the gap to Transnistria. And again, this is probably forever. So that is why it was so hard for the Russians to make this decision. So why did they do it? They did it because they had to. I have made several videos where I have described it as a hopeless idea to defend these areas west of the Dnipro. They have too many problems with the supply lines across the river. And on the other side, Ukraine had great supply lines in the same area. So they were fighting in an area where Ukraine had all the advantages. So they withdraw from Kherson because it is necessary for them to achieve any kind of success anywhere else. The Battle of Kherson has been a resource drain for the Russians since Ukraine announced their sort of, at that time, upcoming counteroffensive back in late June. I think a figure of speech here can be that it's been like if you have an open wound in a leg or an arm, like you can try to stop the bleeding for so long, but if it doesn't work, then eventually you'll have to sacrifice that limb to save the rest of the body, because otherwise you will bleed to death. And this has been the situation for the Russians. Like Kherson has been an open wound, and they were bleeding to death. So they had to stop that resource drain. And that also means that they now take this loss, but they do that with the idea that it will give them some more resources to use for something else. And the big question is, of course, what they're going to do with these resources. I think they have actually already shown us. Russia has recently made some pretty aggressive attacks in Donetsk. So I think it looks like that's where they want to push the front line. But what makes it really interesting is that it's not only the Russians that will free up resources now, it's also the Ukrainians. In fact, they might even free up more resources than the Russians. The numbers that I've seen are that there's about 20,000 Russian soldiers around Kherson, but that the number of Ukrainian soldiers is about 60,000. So Ukraine will also be able to redeploy them somewhere else now and make a new offensive. And that is, in fact, something that Ukraine has to do if they want to keep the momentum, because They will have to create a new open wound for the Russians somewhere else. Kherson has really been the driver for the entire Ukrainian counteroffensive since the summer because it has consumed so many Russian resources. So they now have to find a new way to do this. And my guess is that an attack toward Melitopol is a possibility, but it could also be somewhere else. But they will have to attack somewhere because if they don't do that, then they will hand over the initiative to the Russians. And that means that almost no matter what happens, then the war is entering into a new phase. And when I use the word phase, then that's in a very general sense of the word. It's, of course, possible to argue about how many phases there have been so far because phases are not a definite thing. But I think the best way to describe it is that there have now been 3 phases until now. The first one was the first month or so, where Russia was trying a blitzkrieg kind of thing, and it ended when Russia withdrew from northern Ukraine. The second phase was then the battle for the east, where Russia was gaining territory in Donbass. And that second phase ended after Russia took the city of Lysychansk in the beginning of July, because after that, the Russian offensive pretty much just stopped advancing. And the reason why it stopped advancing was, to a large extent, that Kherson started to become a resource drain. And then the third phase has been the Ukrainian counteroffensive, where they have taken back a lot of territory in the Kharkiv region and now in Kherson. But it has been the battle over Kherson that has been the driver for this counteroffensive. And that is why I say that the Russian retreat from Kherson is the beginning of the fourth phase of this war. We don't know what the theme is going to be for this next phase, but there will be a shift because the thing that has been the driver for the third phase is no longer a thing. It's possible that Ukraine can continue their counteroffensive, but they will have to come up with some other way to create sort of the dynamics that make it possible. I want to end with a couple of reflections about Russia's General Surovikin, who is in charge of the operation in Ukraine. He got this job in the beginning of October, and it happened in connection with some other things that Russia did. And if we look at these things together, then I think they show sort of the contours of a changed strategy. The first thing they did was the annexation of parts of Ukraine. I think it was a mistake for Russia to take this step, and I think it looks like an even worse decision every day. But the most significant thing about it was that the annexation was not just along the borders that Russia actually controls. It was along the old administrative borders, and that means that they annexed areas that they currently don't actually control. So Russia sent a clear message about their ambitions, that they definitely need to push Ukraine out of these areas as a minimum before there can be any talk of a peace deal. The second thing they did was that they declared mobilization so they could solve the problem they had with not having enough infantry. The third thing they did was that they appointed a unified commander of the entire operation in Ukraine. So this is General Surovikin. Russia didn't actually have one general in charge before. They had multiple generals for sort of various subsections of the battlefield. But they obviously felt the need to have one person in charge of sort of the whole thing. And they also wanted this person to have a public-facing role. So Surovikin has been in the media quite a lot. So I guess the hope is that he can become a kind of war hero. And if things go wrong, then he can take the blame. Then they also started the air campaign against Ukrainian civil infrastructure like the power grid and the water supply. And finally, they are withdrawing from Kherson. I think all of these things can be seen as a kind of package of initiatives that are connected. So the idea has been to put Surovikin in charge, but also to give him some decent conditions to solve the task. So it's a kind of clean slate. And that's why Russia is now retreating from Kherson, so that there can be a new phase of the war where Surovikin can show what he can do. We can see that also from the fact that the withdrawal from Kherson is not some kind of impulsive decision. Like very soon after Surovikin took over, he actually started talking in the media about the need for maybe making such tough decisions about Kherson. So they were preparing sort of the public for the bad news, and it's definitely something that they have been planning to do for a while. The point that I want to get to is that the withdrawal from Kherson is sort of a concession from Putin that he has given to the military because he trusts Surovikin to be able to turn things around in the war. And that also means that there is now a lot at play, because if all these things, like the mobilization, putting Surovikin in charge, giving up Kherson, conducting the total war on the Ukrainian society, if all this doesn't work, like, what more can they do? So what I'm saying is that there now is a big pressure on Surovikin to deliver positive results. Like, he got the withdrawal from Kherson that he wanted, but from now on, everything that happens is his responsibility. And I think the tolerance for failure is going to be pretty small, like both from Putin and also among the influential sort of right-wing nationalists and also in the population in Russia in general. And right now, it looks like Surovikin is a person that everybody has agreed to support and put their faith in. But if he fails, then I think we're getting close to a point where the whole Russian effort can collapse, because it's getting very hard to see what more they can come up with. And incidentally, I made a video some time back with 3 ways that Ukraine can win the war, and a Russian collapse is actually one of them. So if you haven't seen that video, you might want to do so. Okay, if you found this video interesting, please give it a like. It helps a lot. And also remember that you can subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon to get notifications when I upload a new video. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again next time.